Hey, hello everyone, and I'm so happy to be with you tonight. My name is Wayne Gannaway. I'm the Executive Director of the History Center of Olmsted County, and I just want to say that tonight I am broadcasting from our newest exhibit in our exhibit hall. It's about women's suffrage. The title of the exhibit is The Onward March of Suffrage. And we're really happy about it, really proud of it, and we hope you come down to see it. And it does relate to our topic tonight. And so I'm here to talk to you about the article that I had published a little while back in the Minnesota History Magazine. And it's an article that I was so much fun to do, and I was so happy that it got published. It's called The Perils of Peace, of course. And this is the cover of that particular edition. So I hope you can, or if you haven't already read it, I hope you have a chance to read it. So what I'm going to do is go through some of my key points about the article, and in a little bit, we'll be able to answer some of your questions. You'll be able to chat the questions to the moderator, and then they'll let me know what they are, and then I'll do my best to answer them. So let's talk about the article. So, for me, there were three main takeaways from this article. And the first one was that my hometown of Winona has a complicated backstory when it comes to African Americans. And as a matter of fact, I believe that's probably true for many towns, cities here in Minnesota. And I think we're learning that with every day. The other takeaway for me from this research I did and from writing the article was that Frederick Douglass knew that the end of the Civil War was only the beginning of the struggle to achieve equality and he really believed, and I think he was right, to safeguard the Republic. Now, he really thought that those two were intertwined, equality and safeguarding democracy. And the third that I think also resonates with us today is that Douglass was acutely aware of historical consciousness and that historical memory was essential. So those are my three main takeaways from this. And before we go on from this, I want to share some books that I think are really important. First is this biography of Frederick Douglass. It's called Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom by David W. Blight. David Blight has written extensively about the Civil War, Reconstruction, historical memory, as well as Frederick Douglass. So this is a really terrific book. And I'll show you another book in a second. But let's do a little background of Frederick Douglass himself. A quick background on Douglass. He was born in 1818 on the eastern shore of Maryland, along the Tuckahoe River, to Harriet Bailey, an enslaved woman. Douglass said of his mother, "My poor mother, like many other slave women, had many children, but no family." And he also didn't know his father, except that he was a white man. Douglass said of his identity, his father's identity, is shrouded in a mystery I have never been able to penetrate. For our purposes, though, it's important to know that Douglass suffered terribly under his owner on the Eastern Shore, his owner was a particularly brutal slave owner. But when Douglass was loaned out to a family in Baltimore, he was exposed to his most valuable weapon, literacy and rhetoric. And it's from Baltimore that he escaped in 1838, along with his wife, Anna. Eventually, he became an itinerant lecturer on slavery and abolition, and then an author. This is one of his first books that he actually wrote. And then he became a very famous author and lecturer. I mean, we're talking almost like a celebrity. So, and one thing I want to show you, one of the books that really helped him to read and craft arguments was the Columbian Orator. And this is a reprint with an introduction, again, by David W. Blight. And this book that was written in the early 19th or late 18th century, really was important to Douglass's crafting of arguments. So this is another one I definitely suggest you check out. But why Winona? Why did he go to Winona? In his Western speaking tour in 1867, so again, obviously this is after the Civil War, Douglass is a celebrity by this time. There's no question. He is a sought-after speaker. And Winona was his first stop in Minnesota. He arrived there by train. Now, Winona had a lot going on for it. It had boasted a U.S. senator, state Supreme Court judges, one who would later become a state Supreme Court judge. And then there was the Winona Normal School that I've been told was the oldest normal school west of the Mississippi. Now, regarding that emphasis on public education, the Winona Daily Republican wrote at that time, this is a quote, "There is abundant cause for congratulations to be found in the rapid growth of this important element of strength, one of the strongest pillars of public happiness and free institutions." I really like the emphasis they put on public happiness and free institutions. Now, while appreciative of a receptive crowd, I'm sure Douglass took it all in stride. So go to the next one. So, sure, he had these adoring public, these liberals, you might say, at the time, probably Republicans. Even though it was in the North, Douglass was well aware of interacting with white people, whether in the North or the South. And in his autobiography, Douglass wrote of the legacy of slavery and bigotry in the North, quote, "It was in the air, and men breathed it and were permeated by it often when they were quite unconscious of its presence." And he's talking about the shadow of slavery, bigotry that resulted from that slavery, which I find a really chilling quote there, that oftentimes they were unconscious of its presence. I think that's really important to remember, even as he was in Winona, which had presumably some enlightened people. So yeah, there was a core of enlightened civic leadership. And I found it really interesting that that seemed to coalesce around this group called the Young Men's Library Association. And it seemed to be Republicans and perhaps, well, let me back up. It seemed that this Young Men's Library Association was located in other states as well, including in New York and New England. And at least from what we know about the membership in Winona, they were Republican and seemed to be a little more on the liberal side. And perhaps that was also the case in New York and New England. And that's how Winona was able to, and I'm speculating here, was able to get a great lineup of speakers in that winter of 1867. And there is a great picture. Yeah, that's an awesome picture that shows you an incredible lineup of speakers. You have Ralph Waldo Emerson, who came to Winona in a sleigh probably from La Crosse, and it was in a snowstorm. I don't remember who Yeomans is, but Theodore Tilton I'll talk about in a minute. You had General H.H. Sibley, kind of a hero of the frontier days. Of course, Douglas. Wendell Phillips was also a abolitionist, a really important abolitionist. And then maybe one of my favorites is Petroleum v. Nasby. I'll talk about him in a second as well. And this is a real powerhouse of abolitionists and civil rights activists and thinkers. Now, Theodore Tilton, I mentioned that he was on that lineup, that terrific lineup. Theodore Tilton was a New York poet and a newspaper editor in New York City, and he lectured for the Young Men's Library Association a month before Douglass. Here, or then in that photograph, or actually that drawing, he's sitting with the bald fellow sitting across from him was Benjamin Butler, who was a hero for the Union Army in the Civil War, and also very anti-slavery. But it was important that Tilton was in Winona lecturing before Douglass, because Tilton took Minnesota to task for not giving the vote to freedmen, black men. And here's what Tilton said to the people in Winona, quote, "You can never make the color of the skin a disqualification, as Minnesota does, unless you are satisfied to stand condemned. Who shall vote? The farmer, the lawyer, the rich man, the poor man, the black man, the white man? None of these. The citizen shall vote, and no questions asked." It seemed like Tilton was warming up Winonans for Douglass's visit. Another speaker scheduled for that winter was satirist David Ross Locke. And Locke performed in the persona of Petroleum v. Nasby. Now, this persona or character was a shameless, shambling Confederate sympathizer. And this was a device that, to me, brings to mind Stephen Colbert, if you remember that, and the Colbert Report. And now Locke was friends with Mark Twain, and he toured with him as well. And so it's interesting that they were really sticking it to the Confederates and the apologists to the Confederates, and probably some Democrats as well. Ultimately, unfortunately, Locke canceled his engagement, so Winonans did not get to enjoy that performance. Now, Douglass does arrive in Winona in 1867 when it was probably still cold out, so maybe he was wearing this attire, which is a snow cap, a really warm coat. This was actually taken in January of 1874, that picture, but he could have been wearing the same thing. Douglass spent much of his adult life on the road lecturing. Winona was just one of many, many other stops along the way. Now, and so this is an important point, and the editor of the Douglass papers, a guy named John W. Blassingame, characterizes Douglass's life very well, and I quote, "Lecturing was a total experience for Frederick Douglass, not confined solely to his delivery of a speech and to crowd reaction. Equally important were the peripheral details, the homes visited and the halls lectured in, friends who aided and enemies who hindered, mob violence, snowstorms, Jim Crow, dirty trains, rude conductors, and boring companions." Really brings it home, that whole idea of touring. Now, I don't know if it was snowing during his visit to Winona or if he had a pleasant train ride, but we do know that Frederick Douglass got a taste of Jim Crow in Winona. The Huff Hotel denied service to Douglass. And ironically, it was a local lawyer who identified himself as a Democrat who ultimately invited Douglass to stay with him and his family. And this incident of Douglass being turned away from a hotel really was taken up by all the newspapers throughout the nation, really. And the Democratic newspapers were saying, oh, what hypocrites those Republicans are. They won't serve Frederick Douglass. And the Republicans, on the other hand, said it was actually not Republicans who owned the hotel, who managed it. They were conservatives. But this became fodder for this debate, this culture war, if you will, between Democrats and Republicans about the role of Black people in public life. Now, the Philharmonic Hall was the venue that Douglass spoke in. And according to the newspaper, the hall was packed with attendees from the entire region. And again, lots of VIPs were there. And Douglass entitled his speech in Winona as "The Sources of Danger to the Republic." And he began by declaring he no longer spoke as a slave, quote, "but in the high and commanding character of an American citizen, having the interest that every true citizen should have in the welfare, stability, the permanence, and the prosperity of our free institutions. And in that spirit, I shall criticize our government tonight." What a great opening. And in his speech, in his talk, Douglass warned of the dangers of the still burning embers of slavery and white supremacy. Douglass was convinced that the dethroned slaveocracy was trying to undermine the Constitution, and they were certainly attacking the freedmen and women. And in an article published in the Atlantic in early 1867, he foreshadowed these themes that he would be talking about. He wrote, quote, "The young men of the South burn with the desire to regain what they call the lost cause. In fact, all the elements of treason and rebellion are there under the thinnest disguise." So even after the Confederate Army had voted to turn against the Union, the Confederate States voted to turn against the Union, the Confederate Army was defeated. Douglass was trying to get people to understand that their treason had not ended. But still, Douglass praised the founders and the Constitution while he was in Winona, and he said this, quote, "In the eye of that great instrument, the Constitution, we are neither Jew nor Greek, barbarian nor Scythian, black nor white, but fellow citizens of a common country, embracing all men of all colors." But he warned, "I know of fewer misfortunes that can happen to a nation greater than the overconfidence in the perfection of its government." So he was saying, great, you won the war, you've got electoral victories. Don't get overconfident in this government because it could be undermined. Douglass was warning Winonans and the nation about paramilitary and ideological insurgency by the white supremacists. And he was also reacting to the crisis of the moment, particularly Andrew Johnson, a Unionist Democrat and Lincoln's successor. So Andrew Johnson started off as the vice president for Lincoln, and it kind of balanced the ticket. Douglass called the office of vice presidency a useless piece of furniture, an incentive to assassinate the elected president. And at Lincoln's second inauguration, Johnson was standing next to Lincoln, and Lincoln pointed out across the crowd, Frederick Douglass, whom Lincoln had met. And in that instance, Douglass and Johnson made eye contact. Douglass recalled in his autobiography, quote, "Johnson's first glance was the frown of the man. The second was the bland and sickly smile of the demagogue." Now, in his speech, Douglass suggested that the Constitution allowed the president to be too powerful. Now, maybe it was just a convenient argument at the time, but he certainly believed it. Douglass certainly believed it. And he accused Johnson of exploiting those powers. So, and I quote, so Douglass is saying that he's exploiting those powers, quote, "in the bad service of blind, unreasoning, stubborn conservatism, to shelter old-time abuses and discourage manly criticisms." But Johnson, as president, was very much a threat to Reconstruction and to freedmen and women. And until he was defeated by Grant in the 1868 election, he tried to thwart Congress's robust Reconstruction programs, and really allowed almost the re-enslavement of African Americans through the Black Codes. The radical Republicans overrode Johnson's vetoes of many of their measures and ultimately impeached him, only to miss conviction in the Senate by one vote, something we've all heard about more recently. Another radical Republican goal Johnson detested was giving blacks the vote. To him and most Democrats, whether in the South or in Minnesota, and to some Republicans, giving black men an equal status with white men was an abomination. But Douglass closed his speech with a note of optimism. He said, "Happy will it be for us, happy for the land, happy will it be for coming generations, if we shall now complete from choice the work which we began under the pressure of stern military necessity." And by that, he was talking about the emancipation of enslaved people and also giving them the vote by choice and not by the stern necessity of military force. And he said that giving black men the full citizenship with the vote would help safeguard the republic and bury the lost cause and open a way to a multiracial society. Tragically, Douglass was wrong on this count. The 15th Amendment, although it did give the right to vote, it didn't guarantee it on the ground. And so really, it did not open the way for equal voting rights for generations to come. Now, Eric Foner, who is a well-known, well-regarded historian on Reconstruction, said that Northern Democrats, unions, and liberal Republicans eventually tacitly accepted voting rights for black men, quote, "while in no way altering their intention of undoing federal protection for black rights," end quote. Sectional reconciliation and reunion among white brothers in arms had no concern for protecting civil rights. Now, Douglass, 20 years later, from when he gave his speech in Winona, he was given a speech in Battle Creek, Michigan, and he exhorted the audience, quote, "You cannot have our aggrieved nation in your midst without injury to yourselves. You people in Michigan cannot allow 7 million people in the South to be disenfranchised without imperiling your own liberties." So Douglass could see, even back in 1867, how the denial of liberties to freedmen and women would infringe upon the liberties of all. Now, according to David Blight, who again, I referenced his biography of Frederick Douglass, David Blight says Douglass was aware that, quote, winning the peace would be a matter of power, but it would also be a struggle over moral will and historical consciousness. And that was really important to Douglass, that Americans not forget the moral wreckage that was caused by the institution of slavery and the war that the seceding states caused, and that it needed to be remembered. And this was really key to safeguarding the Republic. It was part of that whole argument. And he knew that white Americans loathed attempts to, quote, go into their closets and drag out ghastly skeletons. Who would want to have to talk about all the terrible things that slavery did to the people and the nation? But it had to happen. He was saying that it was important to drag out those ghastly skeletons, because at this time there was a strong effort towards reconciliation. Soldiers, blue and gray, meeting on the field as old men, and this idea that everything was fine now. And regarding reconciliation, Douglass said, quote, good, wise, and generous men would have us forget and forgive. But there was a right side and a wrong side in the late war, which no sentiment ought to cause us to forget. And again, the reason he was saying that was because the wrong side was still trying to undermine the Constitution and liberty. This was Douglass's argument. And it was really based on the lost cause. And there was a book, an amazing piece of propaganda. It's called The Lost Cause. It's by Edward A. Pollard. By the way, this copy I found in a library at the University of Lynchburg. I was amazed to pull it off the shelf. It looked like maybe a first or second edition. And as unsavory as it is, I think it's important to be able to read it and to see the game plan that was being hatched. But the agenda of the Lost Cause was not only to forget the moral lessons of the war, but to flip the script to one of states' rights, heroism, and paternalism. Now, the Lost Cause mythology argued that the Confederacy was never defeated, but rather they were overwhelmed by numbers and betrayed by some key generals. And it was about states' rights. This became a sacred story and even accepted in mainstream historiography in the first half of the 20th century. It was incredibly successful. But the Lost Cause was not a secretive conspiracy. It was heralded as an honorable, genteel vision of the South. And it also was an academic, civic, and political project that spanned decades and again was wildly successful. Here's a quote from this book, The Lost Cause. Quote, unfortunately, the world has got most of its opinions of Southern parties and men from the shallow pages of Northern books. And it will take a long time to learn the lessons that the system of Negro servitude in the South was not slavery, that John C. Calhoun was not a disunionist, and that the War of 1861, brought on by Northern insurgents against the authority of the Constitution, was not a Southern rebellion. And the other part of the Lost Cause was the material culture that we see in the statues, in the reincarnation of the battle flag, and so on. These were embodiments of that ideology, that insurgency. And note, Jefferson Davis plays a big role in the Lost Cause. Another person that plays a big role in the lost cause and as a proponent of it, a longtime proponent, is Jubal Early. And Jubal Early had an obelisk in Lynchburg, Virginia, where I most recently lived. And the obelisk honored him for his beating back the Union Army in the Battle of Lynchburg. Jubal Early, who incidentally Robert E. Lee called him the mean old man, and he never surrendered after the defeat of the Confederate armies and the Confederate government. First, he hid out in his home in Franklin County, which incidentally is a historic site, and they do reenactments there every year on his birthday. But then Jubal Early escaped to Mexico and then to Canada before being pardoned in 1868 by Andrew Johnson. So he came back after fleeing as really a traitor of the United States. He returned to Lynchburg to continue practicing law, and Jubal Early became the primary promoter of the lost cause and the authority on published Confederate history. And later he became the president of the Southern Historical Society, which had a long history. It may even still be around, although probably reformed. And so Lynchburg citizens erected this obelisk in 1919. Now, again, it's an artifact of the lost cause more than anything else. And it's still up as far as I know. The last time it came down, it was only because a drunk driver drove into it. But in fact, again, the lost cause masterfully shapes narratives and the tangible elements of public memory. Fort Monroe in Maryland, and by the way, it's a historic site. I highly recommend you go to it. Fort Monroe was the site where Union Major General Benjamin Butler, who I mentioned previously, decided to free enslaved people by declaring those who escaped their enslavers and sought sanctuary at Fort Monroe, he declared them to be contraband so that he would not be compelled to return them to their owners, which irritated Lincoln and some of the higher leadership. So Fort Monroe is known for that. It's also known as the place where Jefferson Davis was imprisoned. And by the way, you can see his prison cell. Again, I highly recommend it. But if visitors were walking around the campus of Fort Monroe, they might be forgiven if they thought maybe it was supposed to be a monument for Jefferson Davis, because there's this rather ornate metal pergola, I guess, arch that says Jefferson Davis Memorial Park. And this is a perfect example of seizing control of the narrative through public memorials. Now, in 1894, Frederick Douglass took a picture with his grandson, Joseph. And it really does show what he was trying to achieve. Number one is that freedmen, African Americans, had every right to the refinements as anyone else, and they could achieve the educational levels and artistic levels of anyone else. But he did see here, he was at age 77 when that picture was taken, and he could clearly see that his message was not winning the day. After all those years of fighting, first for abolition, then for equality, and for the entire time a Republican, since the election of Lincoln, he had to ask, what ground had he advanced? Shortly after his death, the Winona Daily Republican, which had really stayed as a stalwart in the fight for equality, they they published an article upon his death called "Just Criticism: The Late Frederick Douglass on the Enforcement of Human Rights," and they printed a quote about the Republican Party at the dawn of a new century. So we're talking in the 1890s. So this is Douglass, quote, "I have my fears that the victory of the Republicans may make them even a little more indifferent about protecting human rights under the Constitution than when they were in power before," end quote. Meanwhile, the Democrats were still as hostile as ever. Now, I have to say that there were many newspapers that gleefully reported the death of Frederick Douglass, including the Rochester Record and Union here in Rochester, Minnesota. On March 1st, 1895, they derisively noted that, quote, "The live social jackal has become the dead lion." And it wouldn't be until many years later, really, that Frederick Douglass' prominence began to enter the public discussion once again. So in closing, you can see that Winona was a progressive place, but it had those people who, mostly Democrats, 19th century Democrats, who had no interest in equality. You can also see that Frederick Douglass was fully aware that the lost cause was not just a way of a quaint gesture of nostalgia, but it was a threat to the Republic, and that it would also shape history. And he was right. He was right, I think. And so those are the main things I wanted to share with you this evening. And one other book, one thing I didn't mention so much in my remarks is that he also was encouraging Minnesotans to pass a law, a constitutional amendment in the state constitution to allow black men to vote. And it took at least three attempts to finally pass the amendment in 1868. Incidentally, when the amendment was first passed, women also requested the right to allow the Constitution for them to vote. They wanted to eliminate any reference to gender or race. And unfortunately, the legislature, including even progressive Republicans, felt like they couldn't go that far. It was a bridge too far. But any event, another book to read, or an author to read, is William Dean Greene. He is a University of Augsburg professor, and he's written a number of great books about African American civil rights in early Minnesota, including this one, Peculiar Imbalance. And he has another one out right now called The Children of Lincoln. And he's coming out with another one about an African American woman who was fighting both for the right of women to vote and fighting for civil rights. So I'll leave it open to any questions at this moment. So the question is, when you wrote this article, you were living in Virginia, working at Poplar Forest, Thomas Jefferson's retreat house built by enslaved people. Yes, indeed, including some of his own enslaved children with Sally Hemings. Now that you are back in Minnesota for a while, is there anything different you would have written or concluded in your article? Oh, that's a great question. That is a really good question. I think that I don't have a good answer for that, but I'm sure there must be something. I think it's easy for us in Minnesota to give ourselves a pass because, we were part of the Union, and we often view ourselves as more progressive in a traditional sense. But one thing, here's a couple things that I do want to reflect on, is that I wish there was a way of, number one, learning more about what women were saying in Winona at the time. Really, I was going off of mostly what Douglass was saying and what the newspapers were writing, and the newspapers were mostly written by white men. So that wouldn't be one piece of it. The other piece is African Americans at the time. What were they thinking? What were they writing about? There was one African American gentleman in Winona who, if you read the article, there's a really funny advertisement. He was a barber, and he apparently created this hair tonic. And there was a hilarious advertisement in the Winona Republican about how Jefferson Davis was languishing in the Fort Monroe prison, and his hair was looking awful, and he might actually die. But thankfully, Abe Miles hair tonic was given to him, and he's now surviving, and he's going to live. And then this same gentleman then became an officer of a celebration of the enfranchisement of African American men. This gentleman traveled from Winona to St. Paul or Minneapolis and was one of the vice presidents of that particular event. So I would love to learn more about him. I see that Professor Greene will be part of a virtual talk on July 9th. I'll be definitely listening on that one. Okay, here's one. The Huff Hotel must have been on Huff Street. Anyone know? It was actually named after a important guy in town, a businessman named Huff. I don't remember his first name. And he actually, that was a bit of a controversy at the time. So a lot of people were criticizing him because apparently he was a Republican, and they were saying, oh, look at this Huff, the Republican, his hotel won't serve Frederick Douglass, one of their favorite black people. And in reality, then the Winona Daily Republican retorted to that Democratic claim that Huff had actually either sold the hotel or was no longer, one way or the other, was no longer involved in it. And it was really conservatives who owned the hotel. But I don't believe it was, Huff Street was later probably named after him later on. Winona County Historical Society, our friends at the Winona County Historical Society could definitely give you more detail on that. Well, let's see. Share a little bit more about the history of the center. Yeah, so the women's suffrage exhibit here at the History Center in Rochester, Minnesota, there was a critical mass of local women who were organizing. Many of them were wives of yes, doctors, mayors. These women were more of the elite class for Rochester, and they were organizing and really doing the sort of groundwork of building support for the right for women to vote. And so what we do is we cover both those local important women, the national level and the national organization. And And we also talk about the consequences or the costs that the women paid in pushing for their rights. So, for example, we've recreated a jail cell that I believe it was Alice Paul was, or one of the suffragists was jailed in, as an example of that. So you can actually open it up and go in it to try and bring that to life. The other thing that's really interesting about the women's suffrage movement was that not only were they working to win the vote, and they were meticulous at it, but they also wanted women to know how to vote, the mechanics of it. So they literally had practice voting booths that they would make available to women so women could go in and practice it, which I think is really awesome in as far as organizing and civic engagement. Really neat education piece. So now we have also we've constructed some of these practice voting booths so that visitors can, as they're walking through the exhibit, they can go into the voting booth that's built the same way that these women built their voting booths and practice voting for perhaps an election coming up. So it's a lot of fun. We're super excited about it. Sarah Berger Stearns is one of the women who worked very hard at women's suffrage. Her husband was mayor of Rochester, and he also was a commander of a regiment of the United States Colored Troops. So interesting cross-section or interesting intersections of rights that people were interested in. And I think that's a neat part of the American story is the fight for rights, the struggle for rights, and greater liberty and equality. And what Douglass was doing and what the women organizers were doing for the right to vote is part of that narrative. Okay, let's see if we got anything else here. Okay, here we got Jerome Christensen, hailing from Winona. I've read some of his articles. Huff Hotel was and is at 3rd and Johnson Streets, 2 blocks east of Huff Street. And it's incidentally right very close to the Winona County Historical Society too. So yeah, so that is still standing, which is really cool, actually. Do we know who was the first African American candidate for office in Minnesota? I don't know that offhand. I think I might have read it somewhere. If anybody knows, they can chat it out, or maybe our friends moderating this can answer that. Okay, I think that's it.